Well, good morning, everybody. As those who are on for a few minutes know, I'm having some computer problems. I'm on my cell phone this morning, and hopefully that will last and not be interrupted in any fashion. But we'll do our best. I'm privileged again to have Professor Louis Johnston from St. John St. Ben's with us. He is very popular in the media these days. He gave me his link to Almanac of a couple weeks ago, which I watched, but didn't realize he was on last night talking about tariffs again. So I hate to bore you with the subject, Professor, but you'll get to do it again. But here's my opener for you.
Good.
Earlier this week, Mr. Trump gave a speech, not officially a State of the Union, but pretty much tantamount to it. I don't know if you watched it or at least read about it. The Dems gave a response. I'd love for you to be the economic response to Trump's speech, which basically gives you the opportunity to talk about anything you want to talk about.
Well, thank you for inviting me this morning. This is always a fun thing to do. I think it's important to talk about these issues and think about them. So, yeah, President Trump on what was it, Tuesday, Monday? I can't remember.
It was
You just
Tuesday.
said so, Tuesday. Um, he gave a speech that I didn't watch it because I just couldn't, but I read it. I actually read some of the transcript and then read some of the analysis of it. What he did on Tuesday was he basically announced the end of 80 years of U.S. economic policy. It had already stopped. He'd already stopped it, but he was pretty clear about it. And let me give you a little bit of background. What I mean by that is between 1790 and 1934, the U.S. used tariffs as a key part of its economic policy, raising them or lowering them, but keeping them relatively high most of the time for a variety of reasons that we can go into. But after the disaster of Smoot-Hawley and the collapse of trade during the Great Depression, Congress basically washed its hands of tariff policy and handed it all over to the president in 1934. And the policy of the United States since 1934 has been to lower tariffs and open up trade as much as possible. And so every few years, we would have these negotiations through what was known as the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. So, for example, President Kennedy called for one of these negotiations, and it was called the Kennedy Round, and that started to be called, they started to be called rounds. Anyway, U.S. economic policy always was reduce tariffs, lower trade barriers, make trade easier for everybody across the world. Partly it was a political strategy as part of the Cold War, but partly it was also just an economic strategy that not only will it help our trading partners, but it'll help us. That started to erode in the 1980s. First of all, some of you might remember that famous chicken tax of the early 1980s. The United States put tariffs on light trucks from Japan, and in response, Japan put tariffs on exports of chicken from the United States. And so that was kind of the first shot in these trade wars. But over the course of the 80s and for the last 40 years or so, there's been kind of a strategic use of tariffs, either for
Say the last 4 years or 40
40,
years?
40, the last 40
40.
years. There's
Okay.
really been a strategic use of tariffs for particular industries. What Trump announced on Tuesday was, we're not going to do that anymore. We're just going to war full time. We're breaking that whole mold, and we're just going to raise tariffs on entire classes of goods against entire countries. This is uncharted territory.
Why? Why?
Well, I
How
surprised
does Trump do
Kathy.
anything he does?
I surprised Kathy and why am I forgetting? And Eric last
Eric?
night with my response. They told me afterwards because they asked me the same question, and I'll give you the same response. Um, Nobody knows, and that's the problem. If it was clear that raising tariffs was being used as a bargaining chip, then you could bargain. If it's clear that tariffs were being raised in order to raise revenue, you could have an argument about taxation. If they were being used to somehow deal with trade deficits and things like that, you could do it better through negotiation. But we have no idea. That's the problem. Nobody really knows why he's doing it, except perhaps out of spite, pique, or maybe even being a bully.
There's a philosophy or a political theory, and I don't know much about it other than its name, and maybe you do, and if you do, great. It's called chaos theory. Does that ring a bell?
Oh, yeah.
What is it, and does that apply here? Is that what this is all about? Just creating chaos?
It could be. So chaos theory is the idea that small changes in one place or with one variable can end up having huge effects all over. And part of the problem with relying on that, and I think he might be, is you can't predict where it will go. That's one of the reasons why people have avoided doing that in economic policy. You set something off and you don't know where the end is going to be. And that's okay if you're just talking about, running a business or something, because the impact of that's not necessarily going to be very big. But when you're talking about the scale of the biggest economy in the world changing its economic policy radically, to me, that's nonsense.
Well, I should note, by the way, for people on the call, that I've been having computer problems, and although I have the privilege of seeing Professor Johnston and myself, I can't see anybody else, and in particular, I can't see if there are raised hands for people who want to pose questions. And of course, we want to be able to do that. Curtis, you may need to jump in and tell me there are people with hands
Sure.
raised, but I did see
Sure.
a comment.
Mary
Yes,
has a
I was just gonna say there's a comment. There are no raised hands, but I can jump in when I see a raised hand, if that's okay with
Okay,
you.
and Mary,
love that.
I think I saw your comment. It flashed by me pretty quickly. You want to repeat it out loud so we
I,
can
I
address it?
I can repeat it.
Oh,
She
okay, go
says,
ahead.
I don't understand manufacturing abroad. It seems to me American companies work very hard to develop it in large part because of lower labor costs. And now I don't know who they is, want to impose penalties on other countries, bring manufacturing back. Can you talk about the impact maybe of tariffs on manufacturing in the US versus abroad? And yeah.
And before you start that, Professor, I wanted to go back to the beginning of the subject of tariffs, which is what is a tariff? How
Oh.
does it work?
So that's a great question. So a tariff is a tax on an imported good. So a tariff on sugar, for example, is a tax on any sugar that's imported into the United States. And I picked that one because one of the projects I'm working on is I'm the founder of General Mills is a person named James Ford Bell, and I'm going through his papers at the Minnesota Historical Society. And one of the things that is in his papers is lots of stuff about tariffs on sugar during the 1920s. So anyway, that's a bit of a tangent. But so a tariff is a tax on a particular imported
Okay,
good.
stop
What?
stop there for a second because
Yeah.
I'm trying to understand the logistics and mechanics of that.
Oh,
So in Mexico, they make sugar. They want to sell sugar across the border in Texas.
mm,
Somewhere along the line, there is a tax placed on that sugar. Where is it? Where does the money go? Who pays it? I understand the consumer pays it, but in what fashion? And here's one. I know that when you have an increased cost, economically speaking, that cost does not get passed on dollar for dollar to the ultimate consumer. So are some of these costs of tariffs being absorbed by the manufacturer? And if so, what happens to that?
this is this is great. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. So the way it works in the United States is that when a tariff is imposed on a good, the tax is collected at the port of entry. So, for example, if we're importing sugar from Mexico, it gets taxed when it literally crosses the border. Now, there are all kinds of things that the Commerce Department allows, like you can actually pay it when it's put in a truck in Mexico. But let's leave all that aside. It's the idea is when it crosses the border, it pays a tax. So who pays that tax? Well, literally, the person who is bringing it across the border is responsible for handing over the money to the United States government. And to me, that's part of the problem of what's going on here is people think, okay, so since the company that produced the sugar in Mexico is bringing this sugar into the United States, they must be paying the tax. No. What's going on here is let's step back. Consider the company in Mexico that's producing the sugar. They need to come up with, I'll just pick a number, $1 per pound of sugar. Where are they going to get that dollar? Well, part of it is they could raise the price they charge for the sugar and get it from the consumers. They could, on the other hand, take the money out of their own coffers, either through reduced wages to their workers, squeezing their suppliers, or reducing their profits. Well, what combination of all of those people ends up paying the cost depends on a whole variety of factors. For example, how much do the consumers pay? Well, it depends on how much they can substitute for sugar. Can they switch over to corn sweeteners or something like that? If they can relatively easily, then they're not going to tolerate much of an increase in price, and most of the cost is going to fall on the producer. On the other hand, if sugar is something that they desperately need and they're going to pay whatever they need to pay, well, then most of the burden will end up falling on the person who's buying the sugar. It's just a complicated, I'll just use the technical term, mess of problems here in trying to determine who pays. But what's crystal clear is that the producer, the person who's producing it and then bringing it into the United States, does not bear the entire cost. It is not simply a matter of collecting money from producers in Mexico or Canada or China and transferring that money into the United States. A lot of the revenue that's flowing into the Treasury is ultimately coming from American producers who might be using imported inputs or American consumers. Now, I
And
didn't keep track of all your questions, Ron. So I
I
don't know
was
if I
gonna
caught
say,
them all.
I was gonna say, can we circle back to the impact on American manufacturing, which is what Mary Bren asked?
All right, so Mary asked, there's a couple of things going on here. So one of the things that well, I said we had broken American economic policy of 80 years. There's another one that we're breaking of 60 years, which is from the mid 1960s. It was becoming pretty clear that American manufacturing was having a difficult time because labor costs were becoming higher than other places. So, starting under President Eisenhower and going on under Kennedy and Johnson, they came up with the idea of why not have a free trade area between Canada and the United States in order to benefit the American auto industry? We could do things in Canada that are relatively cheap to do and do things in America that are relatively cheap to do and save jobs in both places. So, starting in 1965, we had free trade in everything having to do with assembling automobiles. In 1994, with NAFTA, we expanded that to Mexico. But the idea was to help preserve manufacturing in the United States. So I think it makes a lot of sense to have open trade or to have relatively free trade because I think it promotes what economists call comparative advantage. That is, what people are relatively good at doing. And we're relatively good at high tech manufacturing, at manufacturing that involves innovation, that involves higher educated workers. Let's specialize in that. But I'm going beyond what your question was, Mary.
Well, I've seen some stuff written in the last few weeks about the auto industry in particular, and how about a given car passes back and forth over both the Canadian and Mexican borders half a dozen times, 8 times before the final product gets to market. If these tariffs remain in place, how's that going to change? That's sort of a corollary to Mary's question, as I understand it.
Well, we back in the mid 1960s, we basically made a decision that we were going to have a North American auto assembly process, and that borders weren't going to matter. And now all of a sudden, we're changing the rules on the automobile companies, and in fact, we're changing the rules on every manufacturing company in the United States that has set up integrated manufacturing across Canada and Mexico. We're saying, oh, We changed our minds. We're not going to allow you to move things back and forth. We're not going to, for example, allow furniture makers in the United States to import lumber and other wood products from Canada and then produce raw material or produce the parts that are then assembled in Mexico for furniture. Nope. Sorry, changed our minds. We're not going to do that. We're going to raise your costs. So to me, that's going to hurt a lot of manufacturers in the United States.
So how do we get those products that are made cross-border? Are they just no longer going to exist?
They're going to be more expensive. I think that that's going to be the ultimate consequence, at least in the short term, is that GM is not going to stop producing trucks in Mexico. They're just going to end up trying to raise the prices of them, and then that process I mentioned a while ago is going to determine, all right, do people slow down their purchases of trucks? Do they buy them anyway and pay higher prices? That's all going to have to work itself out. But ultimately, over like a 5 or 10 year horizon, I think a lot of American manufacturing companies are going to be asking, does it really make sense to stay here? Does it perhaps make more sense to move our operations even farther afield? If we're going to pay tariffs, why not go to the cheapest labor, go and find the cheapest labor we possibly can in order to offset those tariffs? That's an unintended consequence that I don't hear anybody talking about.
Yeah, I was just going to say that's not one that I've heard yet. One of the things I mentioned in my earlier questions was, do all of the dollars that go to the tariffs end up coming out of the consumer pocket, or do some of those costs get absorbed by someone along the chain?
Some come out of the consumer's pocket, some comes out of the producer's pocket. It just depends on how sensitive each side is to prices. It's especially in the consumer's hands about this because, if they decide that an increase in price is just no good and they stop buying it, well, then all the cost is going to fall on the producer. So it's going to depend a
Right.
lot on how people react.
Somewhere along the line, new Commerce Secretary Lutnick said that tariffs are not inflationary. Do you agree?
Well, in a strict sense, they might not be because, and this is where I find some of the language that's used to be a little evasive, shall I say, if I'm going to be nice about it, flat out lying if I'm not going to be nice about it. So inflation is an increase in prices. So if a whole group of goods and services go up in price over the course of the year, that means we have inflation. Well, what a tariff does is it raises the price basically once because of the tax, and then it doesn't affect what happens to prices after that necessarily. So in that strict sense, tariffs don't cause inflation. But they're gonna affect the way that businesses make decisions. They're gonna affect the way that they charge their prices. And so, yes, it's gonna affect the inflationary process somewhere. I see David's got a.
And so prices are. I'm sorry. As prices go up, demand goes down. Basic micro 101. Which means profits go down, which means the stock market goes down, and everybody's retirement is reduced.
Yeah, well, I don't like that one.
Uh, Ron, David has his hand up.
Really? Oh, okay. David, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you. This is very interesting. I have two unrelated questions. Um, One is the policies that Trump is pursuing here, I would say, have been more traditionally urged on by certain factions within the Democratic Party than the Republican Party. And do you think that this is part of his trying to appeal to the working class union part of the Democratic Party as this potential realignment of voters is taking place?
Mhm.
And the second unrelated question, can you talk a little bit about how some of these tariffs against Mexico may be in response to manufacturers in China trying to evade the tariffs that are being placed against China by moving goods through Mexico to come into the United States. And I'm finding this very interesting. Thank you.
I'm glad that I'm doing what Ron asked me to come and do, which is answer questions and enlighten a little bit. So let's start with the second one about the Mexico tariffs. That one is really interesting to me because I think part of the concern that the Commerce Secretary has expressed and a couple of the trade officials is that somehow Chinese goods are going to come into the United States and evade tariffs by coming through Canada and especially through Mexico. So if you put a tariff on Chinese goods, they would have to, they have to pay the tariff at the border. But if somehow they send components to Mexico and then sell the stuff in the United States, if there's not a tariff on Mexico, they're going to be able to bring it in. I, I see the logic of that, but I think that's using an atomic bomb to get a mosquito. This is a problem that I just don't think is best solved by putting tariffs on Mexico and China. It would be much better to deal directly with the problem and negotiate something with Mexico and China. So that one I don't. That one I think is I think that's true that they are doing that. I wish they wouldn't. The question about Trump policies and historically being proposed by Democrats, I think is really intriguing. And I think a lot of that is actually where his here I'm going to stray into political science a little bit, but it is where some of his popularity came from. If you go back to the 1980s, for example, I'm 64, so I remember this stuff pretty well. We had a huge debate over what then was called industrial policy, that we need to have a formal set of government policies that support and protect American manufacturing, especially at that time against the Japanese manufacturers. And tariffs and other trade policies like that were part of the toolkit for that. And in the 1980s, Trump himself started embracing that stuff. And in fact, that's one reason why he was identified during that time as a Democrat, because he was pushing these kinds of trade policies. I think that he has made common cause with people who, over the years, have in the Democratic Party pushed for example, steel tariffs, auto tariffs on autos and auto parts, and he's pulled those people either away from the party or at least pulled them towards voting for him, if nothing else. Hope that got your.
Curtis, are there any other hands up at the moment?
I don't
Curtis,
see any other hands up.
The question in the
okay.
chat.
Someone did say something in the chat, but it was Mary again, and she said when tariffs were imposed on China, American retailers worked with Chinese companies to develop manufacturing facilities in Mexico.
It's a real issue. There's no question about it.
Yeah. Senator
So how
Jim
much
Carlson
money
has
is
his hand
raised
up.
by?
Sorry, Ron. Senator
Oh, okay.
Senator Jim Carlson has his hand
That's
up. Excuse me.
fine. I'd much rather listen.
Yes,
I'd much rather listen to Jim than me.
Professor, I have two questions on the levying of a tariff.
Sure.
One is when let's just use a car. When a car is partially assembled in one location, and then maybe brought into Canada, partially assembled or in parts, and then it comes back to the U.S. Is the tariff levied on the entire value, or is it on the added value in that country?
That's a great question, and that's part of the confusion that the Trump administration has been sowing right now. Is that you can do it either way. So just to make sure everybody understood your question, it has some subtlety to it. So suppose you are assembling a car and you bring axles in from Canada. You probably would pay a tariff on the axles, but if you brought the whole car in from Canada using an American-made axle, would you tax the entire value of the car or the difference between what the car sold for in the United States minus the axle that was produced in the United States? And the answer is you can do it either way. Tariffs have traditionally gone for the value added approach, that is the minus the American components. But I was looking through some of the stuff that the Trump administration has, and that's part of the confusion that people are dealing with right now. A lot of the rules aren't clear about whether we're going to do value added or just retail price, or what the price is being paid business to business. So it's increasing that uncertainty that we're having to deal with.
Second part of the question is when a tariff is levied on an incoming product, uh, is it paid in the country that's bringing it in their currency, or can it be paid in the exporting company or
Oh, I wish you
country's
were in my
currency?
intro to econ class because I want my students to learn to ask these questions because that's another thing. They have to pay in dollars. And so this is one of the conundrums, and if you don't mind, I'll just spend a minute on this. This is one of the conundrums that the Trump administration, and I'll even say the Biden administration to some extent, just didn't wrestle with sufficiently, which is suppose you want people to do things like pay tariffs in dollars or build factories in the United States. If they're going to build factories in the United States, you're not going to let them pay in yen or euros. They have to pay dollars. Well, let's just think about this. How does a company from China get its hands on dollars? They have to sell stuff here. And in fact, they have to sell more than they end up buying from us because otherwise they won't have any dollars left over. See where I'm going with this? What this means is if you want people to invest in the United States and if you want people to hold dollars and use dollars, one of the things you have to do is run trade deficits. There's just no way around it mathematically. And so this is to me the ultimate problem with President Trump's trade policies is that he wants to eliminate trade deficits. Okay, well, if you want to eliminate trade deficits, then what you need to do is you need to discourage foreign investment. You need to discourage people wanting to hold on to dollars. And yet, those are two things that he wants. Well, you can't square that circle. You just can't. And I think that's going to become increasingly clear, not in years, but even in months in the United States.
And
Our
related to
friend
that,
Paul Krugman has a favorite equation, which I'm sure you've seen, and that is that trade surplus or deficit, whatever it must be, plus investment of capital from abroad is always zero.
Exactly.
and what
Um,
does that do
I
with
think
the
that's what you
currency
just said.
value?
Yep, that's exactly what I just said. That's exactly it.
Yeah, what does it do to the exchange rate?
Well, and that's the other thing. So it pushes the value of the dollar up. And by pushing the value of the dollar up, that encourages even more imports, right? Because goods from abroad are cheaper.
Hmm.
So it just it just keeps working against all these policies are working against one another.
So is
I have
anybody
a
telling Mr. Trump this stuff?
Well, I wonder. I wonder.
I have
Jim,
a
did
question that's kind of
Sorry,
goes in
I had a couple hours.
a different direction,
I
if
had a
that's
couple
okay.
minutes.
Oh, I think I hear some
Oh,
background noise. I don't know where that's coming from,
sorry,
but
I'm waking up.
uh, I was wondering if you've heard the term
Yeah,
supply
I know. I
side
was getting told that
progressivism and the
because I picked
abundance
Bill
agenda,
that
and what
option,
your
right?
thoughts are on that.
I think I picked, yeah, I picked cash. Okay.
I have heard the term supply side progressivism and also supply side liberalism too. I don't know
Yeah.
if there's a difference between the two or not, but yeah, the idea is that we should be improving our productive capacity in the United States by doing things like passing decent family leave policies so that men and women who want to work in the labor market can, so that business policies are such that they're encouraged to invest in plant and equipment rather than paying out dividends to uh, private equity companies and things like that. I have a lot. I actually think a lot of those policies are quite intelligent and are the way that we should be going. So I can say more, but yes, I am. I am, and I think those are smart ideas. The problem seems to be um, linking the policies with the economics, and that's kind of awkward to say it that way. But what I mean by that is people don't seem to understand or see the connection between making sure that we have affordable quality childcare with labor markets. It just seems to go over people's heads or something. And to me, that would be one of the best things that we could do, would be to make sure that we've got that. My wife wrote a whole book on this actually about World War II, that early on after Pearl Harbor, it was very clear that in order to promote production in the United States, you were going to have women in the labor force. And the only way to get women in the labor force was to take care of their kids. And the only way to take care of their kids ultimately was for the government to have federal child care policies that paid for or subsidized child care in the United States.
And you anticipated one of my questions. Well, first off, can you hear me? And I'm not sure if I've got my mute on.
You switched.
Did I switch?
No, you didn't.
Uh-oh.
Now you're fine.
All right. Can you still hear me? Yes. Okay. Senator Carlson started asking some questions and kind of anticipated where I wanted to go next, and that is the impact of tariffs on the state of Minnesota, and in particular for Jim Carlson's purposes, what he and the state legislature can do to minimize that impact if there is one.
Oh, that's a tough one because I think the place that it's really going to show, well, there are two places it's really going to show up. First, it's going to show up in agriculture, because the natural thing for countries that are being tariffed by the United States is to retaliate against American agricultural products. So I think that's going to be a big spot, and it's not clear to me how much the state can do, especially given its budget situation. Um, I was looking this up the other day. The Trump administration sent 60, depending on how you count it, 60 to 80 billion dollars to American farmers to compensate them for the losses due to tariffs in 2018 and 2019. So I'm guessing you're going to need $100 billion or more to do the trick for American farmers in the United States. The fraction of that's going to have to go to Minnesota farmers.
Yeah, but who's going to actually raise that money? I mean, you really think the Republicans are going to pay that?
Well, exactly. I mean, the rhetoric is going to be, oh, well, we'll just take the tariff money and give it to the farmers. But of course, it doesn't actually work that way. Um, the other group that's going to be hurt is manufacturers that use imported inputs. So, for example, I live in St. Cloud, and one of the important manufacturers in St. Cloud is New Flyer Bus Company, which is a Canadian company. They produce components in Canada and bring them to St. Cloud, and they produce buses for transit systems throughout the United States in St. Cloud. And say, they part of the thing is we make them in the United States. We don't just bring the buses from Canada, we make them here in St. Cloud, Minnesota. Well, if it's going to cost 25% more, this gets back to, I can't remember if it might have been Dave's question or Senator Carlson's question. It depends on how the tariffs are levied. Is it going to be on the value added? Is it going to be on the entire bus? If the tax is going to be on the entire bus, we might as well close up the factory in St. Cloud and go back to making them near Winnipeg. Um, I'm really concerned about all kinds of manufacturing outfits in Minnesota that might have that problem where they are using imported components and they're going to get slammed by these tariffs.
There is some talk about tariffs replacing the income tax. Uh, do these tariffs going to make that much money? How much money is the government going to make from this?
No, they couldn't possibly replace it. And I don't understand. There's this chart going around. I should have pulled it up for this morning that shows that tariffs covered about 70% of the federal government's needs in 1900. And they'll say, see, we could do that. Well, the federal government was so much smaller in 1900 than it is today, that even if you could raise tariff revenue, you could maybe cover 10%. Maybe. That's a stretch. So, no, the idea that tariffs can do this is a fantasy.
Well, to be sure, the Republicans are not really listening, but are there lessons to be learned from things like Hoot Smalley back in the 1930s?
I think history is replete with these lessons. I'm an economic historian, and so this is,
Oh, right.
it's being a doctor in a plague. This is being an economic historian right now is kind of fun in the sense of there's just going to be so many case studies both to write in the future and to draw on for today. Yes, there are some real ones. In fact, last 3 weeks ago, when I was in the archives at the Historical Society, I was looking at old newspapers and papers and James Ford Bell's papers. And Minnesota farmers were all in favor of tariffs in the 1920s. They were pushing for them in order to promote higher price farm prices. And it was a disaster. It destroyed their markets. And I think that we need to really go back and look at those cases and show how when we raise tariffs, all that does is promote other countries to retaliate against us. Um, it's an arms race, is the way I like to describe it. Starting a tariff war is the same as starting an arms race. And the only way to end an arms race is to have arms control agreements. We need the same thing for tariffs, and that's what we were doing for 80 years was I'll lower my tariffs if you lower yours, and we kind of did that. And now Trump has blown the whole thing up.
I want to move over to cryptocurrency, but before I do, I want to make sure that anybody who has a pending question gets it answered. One I saw in the chat was if there are any restrictions on the use of money raised by tariffs.
You could, and that actually comes back to what I was saying earlier in our discussion that in 1934, Congress basically washed its hands of tariffs. They took the attitude that we've screwed this up so badly, we're just going to give all the authority to the president. And so the president now has tremendous power over levying tariffs and, to answer your question, where the money ends up going. Unless Congress steps in and directs where the money has to go, the president can pretty much put it in the general fund and then use it for whatever he might have control over. So it's discretionary money.
Or he can set it aside or he can set it aside and use it to create a crypto sovereign fund.
Strategic crypto reserve.
Lovely. I thought I saw something. Yeah, exactly. Well, we're going to get to that here in a second. I thought I saw somewhere about the president's authority that he's got to be able to declare some sort of emergency in order to raise tariffs on his own. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah. So under the Trade Act of 1934 and then a whole bunch of subsequent bills that have amended it, you have to declare either some kind of some kind of defense issue or some kind of national economic emergency. But that bar is pretty darn low because the president can simply state, okay, I think this is happening. And then it goes to the international trade. Never remember what the commission's called. It's the part of the Commerce Department that does this. You just send an order over there, and they have to start an investigation. And once that starts, the wheels just churn, and you basically can impose a tariff anytime you want.
Okay, Curtis tells me there's some hands raised. Curtis, can you administer the questions?
Yep, sure. Senator Jim Carlson has another question.
Got to get myself unmuted here. You touched on my question here. How much freedom does and independence does the president actually have? Well, he's a transactional guy, and I'm I think we kind of get the gist that he can put tariffs on, off, up and down in the percentage. But can he? I mean, I know that you can put tariffs on particular commodities. Can he um, take the tariffs off of those products that might be in in his own business, so that he can collect money from everyone else, but still provide gold-plated Bibles and tennis shoes and things like that that are brought in from another country?
Yes, theoretically, yes, the president does have that power. This is one of those unspoken rules that we've not seen the need to write down, which is that the president can't simply create a tariff policy that benefits him and his family and no one else. That's I mean, there are some ethics guidelines, but they aren't specific to tariffs. This has always been a bit of an open issue, and there are scholars who've actually pointed it out and said, you know, uh, especially political scientists have pointed this out. They've said, if someone like a Viktor Orban or Vladimir Putin got into office, they could use this power to basically punish their enemies and benefit their friends through tariff policy.
Hmm.
So I hate to tell you that, but yeah.
Okay.
Curtis, are there other questions?
Nope, that was it.
Oh, okay, good. Then let's shift over to crypto, and we started talking about the sovereign fund or whatever. Again, back to the beginning, Professor. Tell us what crypto is, how it works. We as we were kidding around before we started recording 4 years ago when we talked about this conversation, this subject, we talked about. Gee, I could create my own crypto and call it a Sydney, which is my middle name. But it seems to me that Melania has her own crypto called Melania's or something like that. What is crypto? How does it get created? What's this with all the energy use? Why does it take so much energy for crypto? And how on earth, if at all, is Mr. Trump going to create a sovereign crypto fund?
Okay, there's a lot tied up there. So I was looking around me here because hoped I had a piece of paper, but I don't have one at hand. I could create an asset anytime I want by simply writing my name on a piece of paper or writing Sydney on a piece of paper and trying to get someone else to buy it. That's a financial asset, as long as someone's willing to buy it and hold it. So the question becomes, all right, how do you create financial assets? Or how do you create things that people want to hold? And this I don't want this to get too esoteric, but ultimately anything that people want to hold involves using resources. So using time, using energy, using people's abilities, using stuff out of the ground and putting it together and then selling it to someone in return for money, or maybe in return for another good, but let's suppose that they're paying cash. Well, the way cryptocurrency works is someone sets up a computer and basically puts code on there, um, code that needs to be cracked. And if you can crack that code, then you then become the owner of that code. And you can turn around and you can now trade that code with somebody else who might want to crack it, or someone who might want to just own it and then be able to turn it over to somebody else who could crack it.
Why does
Now,
that have value?
oh, well, there's the question. There's the question right there. Why does it have value? It ultimately has value because the person who wants to buy it thinks they can trade it either for goods and services or some kind of what I'll call real currency, dollars, yen, euros, something like that. But on its own, cryptocurrency has no value.
So, in the current vernacular of Mr. Musk, it's a Ponzi scheme.
And actually, I think in a lot of ways, cryptocurrency is a Ponzi scheme or a pyramid scheme. It really is. Um, I actually like the metaphor of crypto mining because I think it's a lot like gold mining. I don't know if you guys have heard the old joke that the key to getting rich during a gold rush is to sell picks and shovels. I think that's what's going on here with cryptocurrency. If you look at the people who are getting rich in cryptocurrency, they're the ones who are selling computer chips for the computer servers. They're the ones who are providing energy to these server farms. They're the ones who are setting up exchanges for people who want to buy and sell these currencies. It's not the people who are holding the currencies themselves, although on paper it looks like they are. But the question that they're waiting to answer is how can I turn this cryptocurrency into something that's worthwhile? Dollars. So that's where the cryptocurrency reserve comes in, and that's why it frightens me deeply. It deeply frightens me because what we're talking about doing is the United States government handing over dollars, or another scheme that's been proposed is gold out of our gold reserve for worthless beans, right? We're back in Jack and the Beanstalk here. We're talking about handing over real stuff for magic beans. And the US government will then be stuck with, switch metaphors, this toxic waste. It's just going to be sitting on the books of the United States government. And that scares the life out of me because we're going to waste real resources for nothing.
Well, that takes us back to the conversation from 4 years ago about modern monetary theory. Doesn't the government isn't the government in that situation now with any deficits that it spends?
Ultimately, deficits are supposed to, or borrowing is supposed to be backed by taxation. A bond that the government issues is supposed to be a promise, in a sense, to collect taxes. But as you said a moment ago, you can run a Ponzi scheme or you can run a pyramid scheme where you just roll over the debt and roll over the debt and roll over the debt. And that's where there's an idea that's not related to modern monetary theory, but kind of looks like it. It's called the fiscal theory of the price level. So if you want to dazzle your friends, throw that one out there. But this is actually, I would say, a legitimate economic theory, which is um, how does inflation get determined? Well, it gets determined by the fact that if a government issues a whole bunch of debt, so that it's borrowing a whole bunch of money, the present value of all of that has to equal the present value of all the taxes we expect to collect. And if those things don't match up, then inflation has to do the adjusting. Inflation has to adjust the value of the taxes and the value of the debt to make them match up. And so
Well,
that I think is very plausible.
okay, I see there was a comment in the chat. I missed it. What did it say?
A
It
couple
just
of them
said,
there.
Mindy said there's an emotional, psychological value. We can't eat gold, but it's valuable because we decided it was before we discovered practical uses for it. I see a parallel of people valuing crypto to the people who bought Cybertrucks. It was a trend. It spoke to status. Yeah, associating with Elon Musk.
I think there's a lot to that. I think um, it's related to this idea of we better find out whether the gold is still there in Fort Knox. Well, who cares? I mean, really, when you think about it, what difference does it make whether we have? Oh, and we shouldn't be sure. Don't tell Elon Musk we have a big vault of gold at the New York Federal Reserve too. Except we don't own it. It's almost all gold held by foreign central banks on deposit at the New York Fed. But I've long been an advocate of just sell it. Get rid of it. We have no need for the United States government to be having a gold stockpile. It just doesn't make any sense. And in fact, if you look at the balance sheet for the United States government, the gold is valued at $38 an ounce because that's the price it was valued at in 1971. Well, we know
So,
that gold is worth a lot more than $38 an ounce right now. So why not
so if
go
we
out and
sold all the
use
gold,
that
we
to
could, if
we
we
could
sold
pay
all the
off the
gold, we
debt.
could retire the federal debt.
We could pay off a whole bunch of it.
Yeah.
Just sell it.
I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
Oh,
Were you going
that's sell
somewhere?
it.
Well, it begs the question, what's the value of gold? Why is gold so valuable? Why is gold more valuable than cryptocurrency? Why is gold more valuable than that piece of paper you're going to write your name on? Why?
Ultimately, it's I'm using you as as the example, but it's
Sure.
whatever the bargain is between you and me, we can decide what the price is. And that's ultimately what's going on. That's why one currency is worth a certain amount versus another. It's why this drinking glass, I might think that it should cost $2, but they're charging $5 for it. Well, we have to come to an agreement about it. There is no intrinsic value to it, or there might be, but it doesn't have to sell at that. It can sell at whatever we decide. I think the
Again,
stuff that I was just going to compliment my daughter. My daughter makes beautiful art and stuff like that, and I think she ought to be able to sell it for a lot more than she ends up actually selling it for. But I don't get to decide.
oh yes, you do get to decide. You can buy it.
I could buy it, yes,
You know,
or
you can.
subsidize her production of it, which is what I
Yeah,
often do.
yeah. Isn't that the way? Curtis, are there any other hands up at the moment?
Nope, not right now.
Okay, so we have just a few minutes left, Professor. We're going to talk about inflation because that seems to be a hot button for this administration. But as an aside to that, there's talk about changing the way we measure the GDP, and it makes me very concerned about manipulation of numbers,
Yeah.
and then ultimately how that's going to affect markets. Any thoughts on that subject?
That was like a throwaway last week, and it really caused a stir. We already can measure GDP without the government in it. So if you think government is pumping up economic growth, you can just go to the St. Louis Fed, and they have this wonderful tool called Fred, and you can ask it to give you GDP minus government spending. And it's just there. So I think that was a non-issue. But the one of manipulating statistics, yeah, that concerns me a lot. And I think that we have to be vigilant on that. We have to keep our eyes open to any attempt to do that, because as soon as you don't know what's going on with any kind of certainty, um, then you're open to manipulation of all kinds.
It brings us back to the whole notion of chaos that we started out this conversation with, and the uncertainty that is being created, and how do you make markets with that? How do individuals plan their futures with that? How do you save? How do you buy houses? How do you do anything in the face of this uncertainty?
That's my ultimate concern, is that I feel like well, not feel like, I know from reading things that businesses are pushing off making investment decisions about building buildings, about hiring and things like that. Households are putting off spending decisions because they don't know whether they're going to have a job, or whether they're going to get a raise, or what the prices of things are going to be. And that kind of thing can seize up markets pretty badly. And I'm concerned that that could spread. And, the worst case scenario is that would push us into a recession.
Well, we have hit our hour, and I want to be respectful of everybody's time, including, of course, yours, Professor. I think our dear friend Paul Krugman would be delighted to review a transcript of our conversation today. It got a little wonkish, as he is prone to say, and I know his column this morning was dealing with value-added tax as an issue in the tariff context. Again, Curtis, any other questions pending before?
I don't see any, and yeah.
Okay, so Professor, I want to give you an opportunity to give us the high-level words of wisdom you have to offer on how we can live our lives in the face of this uncertainty and chaos, and in particular, how our elected officials can address some of these issues.
Well, okay, I'll start with the second one. I think one of the things we have to do, and I'm trying to do this in my own small way, is to just call out nonsense, to simply say, this is not true, or this is just this, yeah, this is not true. This is a lie. So for example, yesterday the Treasury Secretary was talking about how the key to keeping the dollar strong is to create a crypto reserve. And this was out on, I think it was Blue Sky or Twitter. And I just retweeted it and said, this is nonsense. And I think
Yeah, I
those of
saw
us
that.
who have some knowledge on this need to speak up and simply say, this is nonsense. Do not believe what this person is saying. We have clear economic theory and practice that says this is nonsense, but we're not doing that. And I don't quite know why. Paul Krugman is, and there are others who somewhat are, but my profession is mostly silent. It really bothers me. So I think we need to do that. And then in terms of representatives, my wife is doing something really cool. She's calling every day to our representative. I think there's an app even called 5 calls per day. We have to get the representatives, especially I think in the House, to understand that this is madness. This is nonsense.
You're talking about the Congressional House in Washington, right?
Yes,
And if I'm not mistaken, you live in Tom Emmer's district?
I do. So we're kind of
Right.
screaming into the void, but sometimes that's what you have to do.
Well, and you may know that, and for everybody on the call, in order to email somebody in the Federal House of Representatives, it's first name dot last name at mail.house.gov. Flood the zone is my message to everybody. Well, Professor, thank you as always so much for coming on this morning. I've appreciated our conversations. I've appreciated the fact that you'll every once in a while respond to my email nonsense that I send to you. It's most instructive, of course, and I like to share it with my friends.
Yeah, I was going to say, anybody on the call, just send me a note. I'm happy to. I just want the conversation. The more the conversation spreads, the better, I think.
I agree with you. Well, that's all for today. Curtis, do you have anything you want to add as chair of our Senate district?